Dawn hadn't yet broken when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel settled into the rear seat of his Horchstaff car. The date, June 5, 1944. The time, 6:15 a.m. Beside him sat Captain Helmuth, his aide-de-camp. In Rommel's lap rested a wrapped parcel, gray suede shoes, women's size 5.5, purchased just days earlier in Paris. Tomorrow would mark Lucy Rommel's 50th birthday, and her husband hadn't seen her in months. The relentless demands of fortifying 800 miles of French coastline had consumed him completely. 18-hour workdays had become routine as he drove himself and his men to inspect every fortification, every gun emplacement, every potential weak point in Hitler's vaunted Atlantic Wall. Outside Chateau La Roche-Guyon, 50 kilometers northwest of Paris, the weather was atrocious. Rain hammered the windows. Wind screamed through the Seine Valley. Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, bid his commander farewell at the chateau entrance. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost casual. Speidel himself had entertained dinner guests the previous evening, retiring past 1 a.m. German meteorologists had issued their forecast with confidence. Storms would persist for at least 2 weeks. An Allied invasion during early June was meteorologically impossible. What Rommel couldn't know, what none of them could know, was that within 36 hours, every prediction he'd made, every warning he'd issued to his superiors, would prove devastatingly accurate. The Allies would land. Germany would have exactly 1 day to repel them. And Rommel would be 600 kilometers away, watching his wife unwrap a pair of shoes while the largest amphibious operation in human history unfolded on beaches he was sworn to defend. The first 24 hours will be decisive. 6 weeks earlier, on April 22, 1944, Rommel had stood on a deserted stretch of Normandy sand. He turned to Captain Lang, pointing his marshal's baton at the beach beneath their boots. "The war will be won or lost right here on these beaches," Rommel declared. "We'll have one opportunity to stop the enemy, and that's while he's struggling through the water to reach shore. Reserves? They'll never arrive at the attack point in time. It's foolish to even consider them. Our main defensive line must be here, at the water's edge. Everything we possess must be on this coast." He paused, gazing toward the gray expanse of the English Channel. Wind whipped his greatcoat. An old scarf wrapped his throat. In his hand, he gripped his preferred marshal's baton, a 2-foot silver-topped black stick adorned with a red, black, and white tassel. Turning back to Lang with desperate intensity, Rommel said, "Believe me, Lang, the invasion's first 24 hours will determine everything. Germany's fate hinges on what happens in that time frame. For the Allies and for us, it will be the longest day." Lang never forgot those words. Neither did anyone else who heard Rommel speak them. The field marshal understood something his Berlin superiors refused to acknowledge. Once the Allies established a beachhead, once they got tanks and artillery ashore, once they linked their landing zones, Germany would never dislodge them. The sole chance for victory lay in destroying the invasion during its initial hours, while soldiers still waded through surf, while landing craft ground onto sand, while chaos and confusion and vulnerability reigned supreme. 24 hours. That was the window. After that, the war in the West would be lost. The debate. The problem? Almost no one in the German High Command shared Rommel's assessment of how to exploit that window, and his most vocal opponent outranked him. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt commanded all German forces in the West, and his vision for defeating an invasion differed fundamentally from Rommel's. At 68, Rundstedt was a career soldier from aristocratic Prussian stock. A Great War veteran who'd fought in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, he was the German officer corps' elder statesman, equally respected and feared. Rundstedt believed in classic mobile defense doctrine that had served Germany brilliantly in the war's early years. His strategy: let the Allies land. Let them commit their forces. Let them reveal their main thrust direction. Then unleash the Panzer divisions in a massive counterattack, a concentrated armored fist smashing through enemy lines, driving them back into the sea. This approach had destroyed entire Soviet armies on the Eastern Front. This was orthodox German military thinking. Rundstedt wanted armored reserves held back, concentrated around Paris and other central positions, ready to strike in any direction once the invasion's true location became clear. Moving panzers coastward prematurely, he argued, would spread them thin across hundreds of miles. It would dissipate their striking power. It would expose them to Allied air and naval bombardment before they could mass for a decisive blow. Rommel considered this suicidal. He'd fought the British and Americans in North Africa for 2 years. He'd experienced Allied air superiority's devastating power firsthand. He'd watched supply convoys bombed into twisted wreckage. He'd seen tank columns strafed until roads were littered with burning vehicles. He knew what happened when the enemy controlled the skies. Any armored reserve held inland would be destroyed from the air long before reaching the coast. Rommel argued panzers must be positioned near beaches, ready to counterattack within hours, not days. Every delay would give Allies time to consolidate. Every mile tanks traveled in daylight would cost vehicles and men. The battle would be decided that first morning. If tanks still sat near Paris when Allied soldiers hit sand, they might as well not exist. Hitler's fatal compromise. The two field marshals argued for months. Rundstedt dismissed Rommel as an upstart, Hitler's favorite, promoted beyond his capabilities. Rommel viewed Rundstedt as a relic from the last war who failed to understand modern combat. Neither would yield. Their staffs clashed repeatedly. The command structure in France devolved into a tangle of conflicting authorities and competing doctrines. Because neither could convince the other, and because Adolf Hitler trusted neither completely, the final decision fell to the Führer himself. Hitler's solution satisfied no one. He split the armored forces. 3 panzer divisions went to Rommel's Army Group B near the coast. 3 more went to Army Group G in southern France. 4 of the best armored divisions, including the elite 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and the powerful Panzerlehr Division, were held in Central Reserve under General Leoger von Schweppenberg's Panzer Group West. But here came the fatal catch. The reserve divisions couldn't move without Hitler's personal authorization. Not Rundstedt's approval. Not Rommel's request. Not Schweppenberg's judgment. Only the Führer himself could release the panzers. The order had to come from Hitler's lips, regardless of where he was, what time it was, or what else was happening. This meant when invasion came, the most powerful armored force in France would be paralyzed until one man in a Bavarian mountain retreat decided to wake up and issue the order. Rommel knew this was madness. He protested repeatedly. He traveled to Berchtesgaden to argue his case personally. He demanded the armored reserves be placed under his command. He wrote memoranda. He made phone calls. He argued, pleaded, raged. Hitler wouldn't budge. The Führer trusted no one enough to grant them control of the decisive reserves. He would make the call himself. When the time came, the panzers stayed put, and Rommel was left with only the forces he directly controlled. Building the wall. What Rommel accomplished in the 6 months before D-Day was remarkable by any military standard. When he first arrived in France during November 1943 to inspect the Atlantic Wall, he found defenses in shambles. The fortifications that Nazi propaganda had trumpeted as impregnable were riddled with gaps. Entire coastline stretches had no obstacles, no mines, no concrete bunkers. Gun emplacements were exposed to air attack. Fields of fire overlapped poorly or not at all. Rommel later described the Atlantic Wall as something out of cloud cuckoo land, a fantasy dreamed up by propagandists who'd never seen actual combat. The wall was mostly fiction, impressive on paper, hollow in reality. Rommel threw himself into the work with furious energy. At 52, stocky and weathered, he possessed the intensity of a man who knew exactly how little time remained. He drove his men relentlessly, visiting every sector, demanding progress reports, personally inspecting every bunker and gun emplacement. His staff covered thousands of kilometers. He was on the road by 4:30 every morning, often not returning until after dark. To his engineering expert, Major General Wilhelm Mies, Rommel outlined his requirements. I want anti-personnel mines, anti-tank mines, anti-paratrooper mines. I want mines to sink ships and mines to sink landing craft. I want mines that detonate when a wire is tripped, mines that explode when a wire is cut, mines that can be remote controlled, mines that will blow up when a light beam is interrupted. He told Mize he wanted 50 million mines planted along the coast. It was an impossible number, but Rommel didn't care about possible. He cared about stopping the invasion. Under his direction, construction pace exploded. During the first 4 months of 1944, more than 4,600 new fortifications were erected along the French coast, adding to the 8,400 built in the previous 3 years. The construction rate doubled, then doubled again. Workers from the Todt organization labored around the clock. By June, more than 5 million mines had been laid in northern France. Rommel had wanted 50 million, but 5 million was still enormous, more mines than the Germans had laid on the entire Eastern Front. Rommel ordered 500,000 obstacles placed on beaches, steel hedgehogs, jagged constructions of welded girders that could rip out a landing craft's bottom, wooden stakes driven into sand at angles, often topped with mines, Belgian gates, heavy steel structures 9 feet high and 9 feet wide, iron beams called check hedgehogs, concrete pyramids called tetrahedra. The obstacles were positioned to be underwater at high tide, invisible to incoming boats until too late. Many were fitted with contact mines. Others had shells mounted on poles designed to explode when struck by a landing craft's hull. Inland, Rommel flooded low-lying areas to trap paratroopers. He dammed rivers and streams, turning meadows into shallow lakes. He planted fields with sharpened poles, stakes 10 feet tall, driven into ground at angles, connected by wires. Troops called them Rommel's asparagus. Some were topped with mines or artillery shells. Gliders attempting to land in those fields would be torn apart. He positioned artillery batteries to create overlapping fields of fire across beaches. He strengthened concrete bunkers, protecting the guns. He expanded trench systems, connecting strong points. He installed machine gun nests with interlocking arcs of fire. Rommel turned the Normandy coast into a death trap. Never enough. Any soldier surviving the journey across the channel would have to navigate a maze of underwater obstacles, wade through surf under murderous fire, cross beaches strewn with mines and barbed wire, assault concrete bunkers bristling with weapons, then face counterattack from armored forces waiting just inland. It was formidable defense, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Rommel had wanted 50 million mines. He got a tenth of that. He wanted 6 rows of beach obstacles. By June, only 3 were in place. He wanted panzer divisions at the water's edge. They remained miles inland, awaiting orders that would have to come from Hitler. Time was the enemy Rommel couldn't defeat. Every day passing without invasion was another day to strengthen defenses. Every day the Allies delayed was a gift. But Rommel knew the gift wouldn't last forever. Spring was turning to summer. Weather would clear. Tides would align. Then the blow would fall. He spoke to one of his division commanders in late May. If we cannot defeat the enemy in the first hours, we will not defeat him at all. Everything depends on stopping them at the water's edge. Once they establish themselves ashore, it's over. The storm. In early June 1944, Rommel was exhausted. He'd been working at punishing pace for months. His health was suffering. He desperately missed his family, his wife Lucy and his son Manfred, now 15, waiting at their home in Herlingen, a small village in the Swabian Alps. As June began, weather in the English Channel turned foul. Storms lashed the coast. Winds gusted to 30 miles per hour. Seas were too rough for any landing operation. Waves crashed against beaches with fury, making any amphibious assault unthinkable. German meteorologists issued their forecast. The bad weather would continue for at least 2 weeks. An invasion in early June was impossible. The next feasible window for attack wouldn't come until late June, when tides and moon would again be favorable. Rommel looked at the forecast and made a decision. He would go home to Germany, celebrate Lucy's birthday on June 6th, then travel to Berchtesgaden to meet with Hitler on June 7th. He needed to convince the Führer one more time to release the Panzer reserves to his command. It was his last chance to prepare for invasion properly. His chief of staff, Hans Speidel, bid him farewell on the morning of June 5th. The weather was miserable, exactly as meteorologists had predicted. Rain pelted the chateau windows. Wind bent trees in the garden. No invasion could come in conditions like this. Rommel would be back by June 8th, he told Speidel. There was plenty of time. Except there wasn't. What the Germans didn't know, what German meteorologists couldn't see, what they had no way of knowing, was that weather was about to change. The Allies had captured weather stations in the North Atlantic that Germans had lost. They had data from ships and aircraft, positions the Germans didn't have. And that data showed a brief window of acceptable weather opening on the morning of June 6th. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, had already postponed the invasion by 1 day because of storms. His fleet was at sea, thousands of ships carrying 156,000 men. They couldn't stay there indefinitely. Men were cramped, seasick, anxious. Tide windows wouldn't align again for 2 weeks. A decision had to be made. At 4:15 on the morning of June 5th, Eisenhower met with his commanders at Southwick House near Portsmouth. His chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, delivered the forecast. Weather would clear enough on June 6th to permit invasion. The window would be brief. Seas would still be rough. Cloud cover would hamper air operations. But it would be good enough. Eisenhower sat in silence for a long moment. Every eye in the room was on him. The decision's weight was crushing. If he launched the invasion and weather worsened, the result could be catastrophic. Landing craft could be swamped. Air support could be grounded. The assault could fail with terrible casualties. But if he postponed again, he'd have to recall the fleet already at sea. Troops would have to be unloaded and reloaded. Secrecy would be compromised. Morale would suffer. And there was no guarantee the next weather window would be any better. Eisenhower made the call. "Okay," he said quietly. "We'll go." The invasion would proceed on June 6th. While Rommel drove through German countryside toward his home in Hurlingen, while he watched rain streak across his car windows and thought about his wife's birthday, 5,000 ships were already churning across the English Channel. 11,000 aircraft were preparing for the greatest air operation in history. 156,000 men were loading weapons, checking equipment, saying prayers. The largest amphibious invasion in human history was underway. And Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the one German commander who understood exactly what was about to happen and how to stop it, was not there. First warning. The first warning came shortly after midnight on June 6, 1944. Paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began dropping into Normandy west of the landing beaches. They were scattered by high winds and ground fire, landing miles from their intended drop zones. Some drowned in flooded fields. Others were shot as they descended. But thousands survived and began organizing to seize key bridges and road junctions. Chaos and confusion. At the eastern end of the invasion zone, British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division landed with greater precision. Their primary objective: bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal. At 12:16 a.m., gliders carrying D Company of the 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry crashed into fields beside the canal bridge, later famous as Pegasus Bridge. Within 10 minutes, the bridge was in British hands. At Chateau La Roche-Guyon, Hans Speidel received reports of the airborne landings. He'd retired late after hosting dinner guests, expecting no crisis. Now the phone was ringing with fragmentary, confusing reports. Paratroopers were landing. But where? How many? Was this the real invasion or a feint? The news was chaotic. Dummy parachutists had been dropped in various locations to spread confusion. Simple fabric figures with firecrackers attached to simulate gunfire. German commanders couldn't tell which reports were real and which were diversions. Some reported thousands of paratroopers in areas where only dummies had landed. Others dismissed genuine airborne landings as false alarms. Speidel telephoned headquarters of Field Marshal von Rundstedt in Saint-Germain near Paris. The staff there was uncertain. Was this the real invasion or a diversion? The Allies had been conducting elaborate deception operations for months. The most extensive was Operation Fortitude, which had convinced German intelligence that the main blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Germans believed a phantom army group under General George Patton was massing in southeastern England, directly opposite Calais. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and double agents had sold the deception completely. Even now, with paratroopers landing in Normandy, many German commanders believed this was just a feint. The real attack, they assumed, would come at Calais. The message no one heeded. Simultaneously, the German 15th Army's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth Meyer, was listening to a radio intercept that should have told Germans everything they needed to know. The BBC had broadcast a coded message to the French resistance, lines from a poem by Paul Verlaine, a 19th-century French poet. Long sobs of autumn's violins wound my heart with monotonous languor. Meyer knew what this meant. German intelligence had been warned months earlier by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, that this poem would signal the invasion. The first 3 lines, broadcast on June 1st, meant invasion was coming within 2 weeks. The second half, broadcast on the evening of June 5th, meant invasion would begin within 48 hours. Meyer rushed to inform his superiors. He burst into the dining room, where General Hans von Salmuth, commander of the 15th Army, was playing bridge with his staff. "General," Meyer said breathlessly, "the message. The second part. It's here." Von Salmuth considered for a moment, then ordered his troops to full alert. But as Meyer hurried out, von Salmuth was already turning back to his cards. "I'm too old a bunny to get excited by this," he said. Crucially, the 7th Army, responsible for the Normandy sector where the actual invasion was occurring, was not alerted. The message went to the wrong army. The 15th Army was at Pas-de-Calais, where no invasion would come. The 7th Army, spread thin across Normandy, received no warning. Hitler sleeps. And at the Berghof Adolf Hitler's mountain retreat near Berchtesgaden, no one did anything at all. Hitler had stayed up late on the evening of June 5th, as was his habit. He watched newsreels with his entourage. He held forth on his favorite subjects, great men of history, Europe's future, his plans for the post-war world. Eva Braun, his mistress, was at his side. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost festive. Hitler retired to bed around 3 a.m. His personal physician had given him sleeping pills. He wouldn't wake easily. When first reports of paratroop landings reached the German High Command, the Führer was sound asleep, and no one dared wake him. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at Wehrmacht High Command, received urgent calls from Rundstedt's headquarters throughout the early morning hours. The reports were increasingly alarming. This wasn't a small-scale raid. Thousands of paratroopers had landed. Naval radar was detecting massive ship movements in the channel. Something enormous was happening. Rundstedt wanted to release the armored reserves immediately. He'd already ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division to begin moving toward Normandy, acting on his own authority because time was critical. But he knew he'd exceeded his powers. Only Hitler could authorize use of Panzer Group West reserves. Rundstedt needed that authorization. He needed it now. Jodl hesitated. He wasn't convinced the Normandy landings were the main attack. He still believed Pas-de-Calais was the real target, just as intelligence had suggested, just as Patton's Phantom Army buildup seemed to indicate. Perhaps these paratroopers were just a diversion meant to draw German forces away from where the real blow would fall. And even if Jodl had been certain this was the main invasion, he couldn't authorize release of panzers on his own authority. Only Hitler could do that. And Hitler was asleep. Jodl decided not to wake the Führer. The situation would become clearer by daylight, he reasoned. No need to disturb Hitler's rest until more was known. Better to wait, to gather more information, to be certain before making such a momentous decision. It was a decision that would haunt Germany for the rest of the war. While Jodl waited and Hitler slept, the first waves of Allied infantry were already approaching the beaches. The beaches. At 6:30 in the morning, the seaborne landings began. American soldiers hit Utah and Omaha beaches on the western end of the invasion zone. British and Canadian troops stormed Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches to the east. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress supposed to hold for years, was being breached in a single morning. At Utah Beach, the landings went almost miraculously well. Strong currents pushed landing craft nearly 2,000 yards south of the intended beach, but this proved fortunate. The actual landing zone was less heavily defended than the planned one. By mid-morning, American troops were pushing inland with light casualties. At Omaha Beach, it was a different story. This was the most heavily defended beach, with high bluffs overlooking the sand and German strong points positioned to create murderous crossfire. The preliminary bombardment had done little damage to bunkers. Many amphibious tanks supposed to support infantry sank in rough seas. The first waves of American soldiers walked into a killing ground. Machine gun fire from the bluffs cut them down as they waded through surf. Artillery shells exploded among landing craft. Bodies littered the waterline. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. General Omar Bradley, watching from offshore, seriously considered evacuating the beach. But the Americans didn't break. Small groups of soldiers, led by sergeants and lieutenants who took charge when their officers fell, began finding ways up the bluffs. They blew gaps in wire. They silenced individual bunkers. By noon, they gained footholds on the heights. At the British and Canadian beaches, landings were costly but successful. Specialized armored vehicles, tanks fitted with flails to clear mines and other unusual equipment, helped breach defenses. By afternoon, British troops were pushing toward Caen, the crucial road junction Rommel had identified as the key to Normandy. And still no one woke Hitler. And still the Panzers didn't move. Too little, too late. When Hitler finally woke around 10 a.m., the invasion was already 4 hours old. He received his first full briefing at 11:30. Even then, he was skeptical. He believed the Normandy landings were a diversion. The real attack would come at Pas-de-Calais, just as intelligence had predicted. He refused to release the armored reserves. His generals tried to convince him otherwise. Rundstedt's staff presented the evidence. This was clearly a major operation, not a raid. Tens of thousands of troops were already ashore. The scale of naval and air support was unprecedented. This had to be the main invasion. Hitler wouldn't budge. He'd made up his mind. The Normandy attack was a feint designed to draw away German forces before the real blow fell at Calais. He would not be tricked. The Panzers would stay where they were. Hour after hour passed. The Allies poured men and equipment onto beaches. German defenders, without armored support, fought desperately but couldn't throw invaders back. At Omaha Beach, the crisis was finally contained by early afternoon. Americans were off the beach and onto the bluffs. The worst was over. Rommel's 24-hour window was slipping away. It wasn't until around 2 p.m., nearly 8 hours after landings began, that Hitler finally authorized release of 2 Panzer divisions, the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr. By then, it was far too late. The tanks had to move in daylight, exactly as Rommel had predicted. Allied aircraft controlled the skies. Thousands of fighter bombers and medium bombers were flying support missions over Normandy. The moment German armor began moving, they were spotted and attacked. And that's exactly what happened. Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armored formations in the German army, began its march toward Normandy in the afternoon. Roads were clogged with traffic. Allied aircraft pounced on the column. Bombs and rockets tore into tanks and trucks. The division lost 5 tanks, 84 half-tracks and self-propelled guns, and over 130 trucks and fuel carriers before it ever reached the front. By the time it arrived, exhausted and depleted, the battle for the beaches was already over. The one chance. Only one Panzer division managed to launch any significant counterattack on D-Day itself. The 21st Panzer Division was positioned near Caen, close enough to the beaches to respond without traveling far. It was the only armored formation in position to do what Rommel had demanded: strike invaders while they were still vulnerable. But even the 21st Panzer was paralyzed by command chaos. Its commander, Major General Edgar Feuchtinger, had been absent when invasion began. He was reportedly in Paris, away from his headquarters, without notifying his staff. No one knew where he was. No one could give orders to attack. When Feuchtinger finally returned in the morning, the division still couldn't move. It was under Army Group B command, which meant it needed Rommel's authorization. But Rommel was in Germany. His chief of staff, Speidel, had to coordinate with multiple headquarters, none of which had clear authority. The division spent the morning fighting British paratroopers near bridges, shedding blood, but accomplishing nothing decisive. It wasn't until nearly noon that General Erich Marx, the corps commander, managed to get authority to redirect the 21st Panzer toward beaches. But even then, the division was ordered to attack in the wrong direction. First it moved west toward Caen Center, then was redirected north toward the coast. The tanks had to thread through rubble-strewn streets of Caen, wasting hours while British consolidated their positions. It was late afternoon before the 21st Panzer finally attacked toward Sword Beach. Breakthrough and retreat. The Panzers pushed through a gap between British and Canadian beachheads, driving north toward the coast. For a brief moment, they actually reached the sea. German tanks were on the Normandy beaches. They'd split the Allied beachhead. But without infantry support, without reinforcements, without coordinated follow-up, the Panzers couldn't hold what they'd gained. British anti-tank guns and tanks engaged them. Naval gunfire crashed down on the exposed armor. The division had to fight just to survive, let alone exploit its success. Then around 9 p.m., nearly 600 Allied transport aircraft thundered overhead, carrying reinforcements to British airborne troops east of Caen. Feuchtinger, watching the massive air armada pass over his positions, panicked. He believed his forces were about to be cut off by a new airborne landing. He ordered a retreat. The aircraft were actually heading away from his position toward drop zones to the east. There was no threat of encirclement. But Feuchtinger didn't know that. He saw the sky filled with enemy aircraft and assumed the worst. The only German armored counterattack of D-Day ended in withdrawal. The one division that had reached the beach pulled back inland. The opportunity was gone. How stupid of me. While all this was happening, Rommel was still in Germany. Speidel had called him at his home early in the morning with news of the landings. Rommel immediately prepared to return to France, but the journey would take hours. He couldn't fly. Allied aircraft controlled the skies. Any German plane over northern France would be shot down. He had to drive 600 kilometers on roads that might themselves be targeted by Allied bombers. Rommel spent D-Day in his car, racing back toward Normandy, listening to fragmentary radio reports of the disaster unfolding on beaches. There was nothing he could do. Every decision that mattered had to be made without him. Every opportunity that arose slipped away while he was still on the road. By the time he arrived at La Roche-Guyon that evening, tens of thousands of Allied troops were already ashore. The 5 beachheads were beginning to link up. The Atlantic Wall had been pierced in a single day. Rommel understood immediately what this meant. He'd said it himself. The first 24 hours would be decisive. Those 24 hours were now over. The Allies had not been thrown back into the sea. They'd gained a foothold, and from that foothold, they would never be dislodged. How stupid of me, Rommel muttered as he reviewed the situation. The phrase echoed what he'd said throughout the long drive back to France. He'd been away when it mattered most. He'd trusted weather forecasters. He'd gone to give his wife a pair of gray suede shoes while his soldiers died on beaches without their commander. The aftermath. In the days and weeks that followed, Rommel fought with everything he had. He rushed reinforcements to the front. He personally visited forward positions, rallying troops, directing counterattacks. He was everywhere, driving himself as relentlessly as he'd driven Atlantic Wall construction, trying to contain the disaster. But it was all a holding action now. The moment for victory had passed. The window had closed. By June 12th, the Allied beachheads had merged into a continuous front 80 kilometers wide. More than 326,000 troops were in France, with more arriving every day. Artillery, Tanks, ammunition, fuel, food, everything needed for a modern army was flowing across beaches and through artificial mulberry harbors the Allies had towed across the Channel. The battle dragged on for weeks. The city supposed to fall on D-Day itself wasn't completely liberated until mid-July. But this was a tactical success that meant nothing strategically. The Allies had achieved what mattered. They'd established themselves in France. They'd created a front the Germans couldn't break. Rommel met with Hitler on June 17th at a command bunker near Margeville in northern France. It was a tense, difficult meeting. Rommel tried to explain the situation's reality. The front couldn't hold. The Allies had overwhelming superiority in men, tanks, aircraft, and supplies. Every day, the situation grew worse. Germany should seek a political solution, Rommel argued. The war in the West was lost. Continuing to fight would only prolong suffering without changing the outcome. Hitler refused to listen. He ranted about new wonder weapons, V-1 rockets that would turn the tide by terrorizing England. He insisted the Wehrmacht hold positions without retreat. He would hear nothing of negotiation or surrender. The word defeat didn't exist in his vocabulary. Rommel left the meeting knowing Hitler had lost touch with reality. The Führer lived in a fantasy world where wonder weapons and willpower could overcome material facts. Germany was going to lose the war, and Hitler wouldn't admit it. The end of Rommel's war. On July 17, 1944, Rommel was returning from an inspection of front lines near Caen. His staff car was traveling along a road near St. Foy de Montgomery when Allied fighter planes spotted it. 2 Spitfires dove on the vehicle, strafing it with machine gun fire. The driver was killed instantly. Rommel was thrown from the car with severe head and facial injuries. His skull was fractured in 3 places. His left eye socket was crushed. For hours, it was unclear whether he would survive. He survived, but his war was over. He was evacuated to a hospital, then sent home to Hurlingen to recover. He would never command troops again. The plot. 3 days after Rommel was wounded, on July 20th, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted at his East Prussian headquarters, the Wolfschanz, Wolf's Lair. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg carried a briefcase containing explosives into a conference with Hitler, placed it under the table, and left the room. The bomb exploded. 4 men were killed. But Hitler survived with only minor injuries. A heavy oak table leg had shielded him from the worst of the blast. The Gestapo launched a massive investigation, arresting and executing thousands. Everyone connected to the conspiracy was hunted down. Confessions were extracted through torture. Names were named. Rommel's name came up during interrogations. Several conspirators mentioned him. Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel, the military governor of France, muttered Rommel's name repeatedly after a failed suicide attempt. Caesar von Hoffaker, Stulpnagel's aide, named Rommel under torture as someone who had known about the plot and was sympathetic to it. Karl Gordeler, the civilian leader of the resistance, had included Rommel on a list of potential government leaders after Hitler's death. Rommel was named as a possible president of a post-Nazi Germany. The evidence was fragmentary and contradictory. Historians still debate how much Rommel actually knew about the assassination plot and whether he supported it. He may have agreed Hitler should be removed from power while opposing assassination. He may have known more than he admitted. The truth died with the conspirators. But Hitler had heard enough. Rommel was implicated. The Desert Fox, the hero of North Africa, the most popular general in Germany, was a traitor. The choice. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals from Hitler's headquarters arrived at Rommel's home in Hurlingen. General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Ernst Mazel came with an ultimatum from the Führer. Rommel could face trial before the People's Court, the Nazi tribunal that had already condemned hundreds of July 20th conspirators to death by hanging. The trial would be public. Evidence against him would be presented. His family would suffer disgrace. His staff would be arrested and likely executed. The verdict was certain. He would be hanged like the others, his body displayed as a warning. Or Rommel could take poison. If he chose suicide, His death would be announced as the result of his injuries from the July strafing attack. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. His family would be protected. His reputation would remain intact. Germany would mourn a hero, not condemn a traitor. Bergdorf had brought a cyanide capsule. Hitler's orders were clear. If Rommel chose poison, he was to take it immediately. The generals would wait. Rommel called his 15-year-old son, Manfred, to his side. The boy had been given leave from his anti-aircraft battery to visit his recovering father. Now, he learned his father was about to die. To die at the hands of one's own people is hard, Rommel told his son. But the house is surrounded, and Hitler is charging me with high treason. Manfred asked if they could fight, defend themselves, escape. Rommel shook his head. There's no point. It's better for one to die than for all of us to die in a gunfight. Rommel went upstairs to say goodbye to his wife, Lucy. I will die in 15 minutes, he told her. On behalf of the Führer, I'm given a choice, either poison myself or appear before the People's Court. He put on his Afrika Korps jacket, the uniform he'd worn in his days of glory in the desert. He took his field marshal's baton. He walked out of the house, accompanied by Manfred and his adjutant, Hermann Aldinger. He stopped once so his beloved dachshund wouldn't try to follow him. Rommel shook hands with his son and his old friend. He climbed into the general's car. The driver, an SS man, started the engine. The car drove away toward a quiet spot outside the village. 20 minutes later, the phone rang at the Rommel house. Aldinger answered. Field Marshal Rommel had died. The lie. The Nazi regime announced that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had died of complications from his war wounds. He was given a lavish state funeral in Ulm on October 18th. His casket was draped with the Nazi war flag. His helmet and marshal's baton lay on top. Senior Nazi officials attended. Hitler sent a wreath with a message praising Rommel's service to Germany. The German people mourned a hero. They didn't know their hero had been murdered by the regime he served. The truth remained hidden until after the war. Only then, when survivors began to speak, did the world learn how Rommel had really died, and why. The triumph and the failure. History remembers D-Day as a triumph. And it was. The courage of Allied soldiers who stormed those beaches under withering fire was extraordinary. Young men, many barely out of their teens, waded through surf churned red with blood, climbed bluffs, swept by machine gun fire, and kept advancing when every instinct screamed at them to hide. They won the war that day, though fighting would continue for another 11 months. The planning and coordination of the invasion was a masterpiece of military logistics. Moving 156,000 men across a hostile sea, landing them on defended beaches, supporting them with naval gunfire and air cover, supplying them with everything needed to fight and survive. All this required organization on a scale never before attempted. The deception operations that convinced Hitler the main attack would come at Pas-de-Calais were brilliant. Operation Fortitude created an entire phantom army that existed only in German intelligence reports. Double agents fed false information. Fake radio traffic suggested movements that never happened. Inflatable tanks sat in fields where German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph them. The deception held not just through D-Day, but for weeks afterward, keeping German reserves pinned at Calais while the real beachhead grew stronger. The German failure. But D-Day was also a story of German failure. Failure of intelligence. Failure of command. Failure of decision. The defenders had the forces to stop the invasion. They had the soldiers, the tanks, the artillery. What they lacked was the ability to use them in time. Rommel had seen it all coming. He'd understood the first 24 hours would be decisive. He'd begged for authority to mass forces at the water's edge, to position Panzers close enough to counterattack immediately, to strike the Allies before they could establish a foothold. He'd warned that any delay would be fatal. He'd predicted armored reserves held inland would be destroyed by Allied aircraft before reaching the battle. He'd said over and over that the war would be won or lost on the beaches in the first hours, before the sun set on the longest day. And then, on the one day when his presence was most critical, He wasn't there. He was 600 kilometers away celebrating his wife's birthday because weather forecasters said no invasion was possible. The Germans intercepted the coded message that warned invasion was imminent. They didn't act on it properly. The warning went to the wrong army. Commanders who received it dismissed its importance. Hitler slept through the crucial hours when Panzers could have been unleashed. His staff wouldn't wake him. Jodl made the decision to wait, to gather more information, to be certain. By the time Hitler was awake and briefed and finally convinced, the opportunity had passed. The armored reserve sat motionless, awaiting an order that came 8 hours too late. When the order finally came, tanks moved in daylight and were slaughtered from the air, exactly as Rommel had predicted. The only division that managed to counterattack reached the beach, then withdrew, spooked by an air armada that wasn't even coming for them. The window, 24 hours. That was all Germany had. Rommel had said it plainly, standing on that empty beach in April, waving his marshal's baton at the sand. The first 24 hours will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. He was right. And because the German high command couldn't act decisively in those 24 hours, because Hitler wouldn't release the Panzers, because no one would wake the Führer, because Rommel himself was away from his post for a birthday party, the invasion succeeded. Within 11 months, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Adolf Hitler was dead by his own hand in a bunker beneath Berlin. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. What if? What might have happened if things had been different? What if Rommel had stayed at his headquarters? What if Hitler had been awake when first reports came in? What if Panzers had been released at dawn instead of mid-afternoon? Military historians have debated these questions for 80 years. Some believe a more aggressive German response could have thrown the Allies back into the sea, or at least contained them in a narrow beachhead that could have been destroyed piecemeal. Others argue Allied air and naval superiority made German victory impossible regardless of what happened on the ground. The weight of metal, the sheer mass of resources the Allies could bring to bear, would have overwhelmed any defense eventually. What's certain is that D-Day was a very close-run thing. At Omaha Beach, the outcome hung in the balance for hours. A well-timed armored counterattack delivered in the morning instead of late afternoon might have made the difference. The gap between Juno and Sword beaches was real. The 21st Panzer Division actually reached the coast. With proper support, with coordinated follow-up, that breakthrough might have been exploited. But none of that happened. The decisions were made or not made. The orders were given or not given. The tanks moved or didn't move. The Führer slept or woke. The field marshal was there or wasn't there. And when the sun set on June 6, 1944, the Allied beachheads were secure. The longest day was over, and Germany had lost its last chance to win the war. Remembering. Rommel's grave is in Herlingen, the village where he died. His wife Lucy lived until 1971, never remarrying, keeping her husband's memory alive. Their son Manfred went on to a distinguished career in German politics, serving as mayor of Stuttgart from 1974 to 1996. He became a respected figure in post-war Germany, helping to rebuild the nation his father had fought for. Manfred Rommel died in 2013 at the age of 84. The chateau at La Roche-Guyon still stands, overlooking the Seine River. You can visit Rommel's office, walk the tunnels his staff dug into the cliffs behind the castle, stand where he stood when he looked out at the Rose Garden and thought about the invasion that was coming. The Rochefoucauld family still owns the property. History hasn't displaced them. The beaches of Normandy are quiet now. The bunkers are silent, their guns rusted and cold. Tides roll in and out, erasing footprints of tourists who walk sand where so many men died 80 years ago. Cemetery after cemetery marks the landscape, white crosses and stars of David stretching in perfect rows toward the horizon. The lesson. But the lesson of D-Day endures. 24 hours. That was all the time there was. Rommel knew it. He said it plainly, standing on that empty beach with his marshal's baton, staring out at the gray waters of the channel. And because no one listened, because no one acted, because one man slept while history hung in the balance, the outcome was decided in those 24 hours. Some moments cannot be recovered. Some opportunities, once missed, never return. The first 24 hours of D-Day were such a moment. The window that closed. For Germany, those hours were the last chance to change the war's course. They let that chance slip away, and the longest day became the beginning of the end. The story of D-Day isn't just about the brave soldiers who stormed the beaches. It isn't just about the meticulous planning that made the invasion possible. It isn't just about the deception that fooled the Germans into looking the wrong way. It's also about time, about windows of opportunity that open and close, about the consequences of decisions made and not made, about the price of hesitation when moments demand action. Rommel understood this with a clarity that bordered on prophecy. He saw what was coming. He knew what needed to be done. He begged, pleaded, argued, raged, trying to convince his superiors that everything would be decided in a single day, in 24 hours that would determine the fate of nations. But the system he served was broken. Command was fractured. Authority was divided. Trust was absent. The one man who could make the critical decision, Hitler, was asleep when history needed him awake, and by the time he woke, the moment had passed. The irony, the deepest irony of D-Day is this. Germany had the tools to win. They had the soldiers. They had the tanks. They had the artillery. They had a commander, Rommel, who understood exactly what was about to happen and exactly how to stop it. What they didn't have was the ability to act decisively in the moment that mattered. They were paralyzed by their own command structure, hobbled by mutual distrust among their generals, crippled by a dictator's paranoia that prevented him from delegating authority to the men who needed it. And so they waited. They hesitated. They gathered more information. They sought certainty when speed was what mattered. And while they waited, 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed the Channel and changed the world. The human element. At the center of this story is a man with a pair of gray suede shoes. Rommel wasn't a monster. He was a professional soldier, exhausted from months of punishing work, who wanted to see his wife on her 50th birthday. He looked at a weather forecast that said invasion was impossible, and he made a human decision. He went home, and that decision, perfectly reasonable, entirely understandable, meant he wasn't there when his presence mattered most. History is made not just by grand strategies and massive forces, but by individual choices, by moments when someone decides to go or stay, to act or wait, to wake someone or let them sleep. On June 6, 1944, a series of such choices, Rommel's decision to go home, Jodel's decision not to wake Hitler, Feuchtinger's decision to retreat when he saw aircraft overhead, combined to determine the outcome of the war's most crucial day. The legacy. We tell this story not to glorify war, but to understand it, not to celebrate killing, but to recognize the stakes involved, not to make heroes of any side, but to see clearly how history unfolds through the intersection of planning and chance, strategy and accident, decision and delay. D-Day succeeded because brave men did impossible things under withering fire. But it also succeeded because their opponents, equally brave, equally skilled, were unable to respond effectively in the hours when response would have mattered. The story reminds us that capability without coordination is wasted, that strength without the ability to deploy it rapidly is no strength at all, that even the most formidable defenses can be breached if defenders cannot respond in time. The final word. Rommel said it best, standing on that Normandy beach in April 1944, pointing his marshal's baton at the sand. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. He was right. When those 24 hours ended, when the sun set on June 6, 1944, the outcome was already determined. Not because Germany couldn't have won, but because in the hours when victory was possible, they didn't act. The beaches were taken. The beachheads were secured. The door to Nazi Europe was kicked open. And it would never close again. 11 months later, Germany surrendered. The war that had consumed the world was over. Millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. An entire generation had been scarred by combat. But from the ashes would rise a new world, imperfect, troubled, still wrestling with the legacy of that terrible conflict, but fundamentally different from what would have existed had D-Day failed. Remembering the longest day. Today, when you walk the beaches of Normandy, you walk on hallowed ground. Every grain of sand represents sacrifice. Every wave that breaks on shore echoes with the courage of young men who waded through fire to reach that beach. But remember also the lesson of time. Remember the 24-hour window. Remember that some moments, once past, never return. Remember that the outcome of great events often hinges not on grand gestures, but on small decisions, a weather forecast believed, a phone call not made, a leader allowed to sleep, a commander absent when needed most. History is made in such moments. The longest day proved it. Thank you for reading this retelling of D-Day's most critical hours. These stories matter because they remind us that history isn't inevitable. It's shaped by choices, by timing, by the intersection of human decision and historical moment. The men who fought on those beaches, Allied and German alike, were products of their time, caught up in forces larger than themselves. They deserve to be remembered not as abstractions, but as real people who faced unimaginable fear and did what they believed was right. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on the fragility of historical outcomes and the weight of decisions made in moments of crisis. These aren't just stories from the past. They're lessons about leadership, timing, courage, and the consequences of action and inaction. Lessons that remain relevant today. Thank you for taking this journey through one of history's most pivotal days.